Sorry, I didn't notice this. I thought it was in English, but the short bio is in Portuguese. Do you mind if I read it in Portuguese? Okay. Então, Dr. Bellotti recebeu seu doutorado em Interação Humano-Computador da Queen Mary and Westfield College, um mestre em Ergonomia e um bacharelado em Psicologia na University College, todos dentro da London University, no Reino Unido. Ela é coautora de 20 patentes e autora ou coautora de mais de 50 artigos e capítulos de livro. Ela também atua como editora associada do International Journal of HCI, atuou como co-presidente do Subcomitê de Trabalhos Técnicos Understanding People para 2013 e 2014 da ACM-CICI Conference. Em 2013, foi premiada como membro da Academia Científica do ACM-CICI por suas contribuições para a comunidade profissional e do campo de IHC. Em 2016, ela recebeu um prêmio Last Impact Award da CSCW Community pela coautoria de um artigo com o Dr. Paul Dorish sobre conscientização, coordenação e espaço de trabalhos compartilhados. Então, é uma honra para a gente tê-la aqui hoje. It's an honor for us that you accepted our invitation. And her talk today is From Meconomy to Weconomy and Back Again, Why the Sharing Economy Ultimately Just Merged with the Mainstream Economy. So I'll pass the floor to Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. So actually, yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really honored to have been invited to speak here, and I just want to thank Raquel and Marcel for both being so kind and helpful, especially with our ordeal getting here. But we made it in one piece, and so here I am. And yes, and I'm going to talk about the Meconomy and the Weconomy. So I'm going to talk about how we journeyed from the so-called, from where we are, then we went to this so-called Weconomy, the sharing economy, and then somehow we wound up right back close to where we started with the conventional Meconomy, which really is not about sharing, but sort of getting ahead for ourselves. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of history about economics and economic experiments, and then I'm going to talk about research into human motivations which drive our economic behaviors. And then I'm going to turn to more recent history and the emergence of the sharing economy, or the Weconomy, and all the idealism that surrounded it with so many new peer-to-peer technology platforms for sharing. And then, having set this context for my work, I'm then going to explain some of the most interesting sharing economy research that my team and I carried out, looking at why people use sharing economy systems and why it isn't really about sharing at all. And then I'm going to end my talk with an explanation as to why I joined Lyft, which is a sharing economy company. And then I'm going to talk about what it means to try to build a company with really high ideals about sustainable transportation in a really tough competitive world. So let me begin with a little bit of history. If you've never heard of him, Adam Smith was a Scottish economist, philosopher and author, and very influential in the Scottish Enlightenment. He was generally a very smart guy. And he wrote two extraordinary and groundbreaking books, really big books, The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, and An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations in 1776, and that's considered to be the first modern work of economics and was his most influential book, although he himself believed that his theory of moral sentiments was superior and continued to work on that one until his death. Now, scholars today believe that Smith was focusing on two opposing sides of human nature, with moral sentiments keeping self-interested motives in check. And Smith observed that the pursuit of self-interested economic goals, curbed by morality, fosters orderly and collaborative productivity in society, even though no single individual has that order or societal productivity as a goal. So of the average worker, he wrote, by pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectively than when he really intends to promote it. And because this piece of wisdom is so important, I'm going to repeat it because you might not have been paying total attention, so listen carefully, because this talk revolves around this one sentence. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Now, hopefully my talk today is going to show why this is a really amazing insight well ahead of its time. Anyway, Smith likened this almost miraculous order in society, which nobody's really explicitly managing, to the work of an invisible hand that was shaping individual activity towards efficient systems of coordinated production. Okay, so Adam Smith, genius, lots of insights on how cooperative economic systems emerge without much supervision, all from self-interested action governed by morality. But later thinkers believed that they could improve on this emergent system of order with innovative economic experiments that didn't leave some members of society struggling in abject poverty. And because economic experiments are also at the heart of this talk, I'm going to give you 3 examples from history and show you how they worked out. And you'll see by the end of this talk that they really underline the old saying that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. All right, so here's historical economic experiment number 1. Robert Owen was a Welsh textile manufacturer. By the way, I am half Welsh. He was a philanthropic social reformer and one of the founders of utopian socialism and the cooperative movement. And Owen established an experimental utopian settlement town called New Harmony Commune on land that he bought in Indiana in 1825. And he wanted to implement a vision for a new moral world of happiness, enlightenment, and prosperity through education, science, technology, and communal living. And this chap, Josiah Warren, was a US inventor, author, and anarchist, and while living in Ohio, was drawn to Owen's experiment in neighboring Indiana. And Josiah traveled about 150 miles by flatboat from Cincinnati, arriving in New Harmony in early May 1825, and joined the Owen cooperative movement to help improve on the work of the invisible hand. But Adam Smith would have had a good laugh at what soon happened to these two, who really intended to promote the economic interests of society, which he'd already cautioned against trying. After 2 frustrating years, the commune failed to thrive, and the harmony in New Harmony Commune broke down due to squabbles over some participants not really pulling their weight and leaving all the work to the others. And Josiah, who was one of the original participants, wrote, "Our united interests were directly at war with the individualities of persons and circumstances and the instinct of self-preservation." And, oh, there's a slide malfunction here. There we go. Robert Owen himself concluded that all cooperative schemes which provide equal remuneration to the skilled and industrious and the ignorant and idle must work their own downfall. He noted that the hard workers would start to feel exploited by the lazy who would just sit around and do nothing, and so the hard workers left to work on their own behalf privately, leaving all of the lazy people in the commune. Didn't work very well. So in 1826, splinter groups dissatisfied with the efforts of the larger community broke away from the main group, and it prompted a complete reorganization. And in 1829, due to constant quarrels, the town's parcels of land and property were returned to private use. So this experiment really ended in disaster, leaving its founder, poor Owen, disillusioned and perhaps a lot wiser about human nature. Back in Ohio in 1827, Josiah decided to create something called the Cincinnati Time Store, which issued and accepted notes backed by a promise of labor. This is historical economic experiment number 2 and was one of the first alternative currencies which you might have heard a lot about from around 2009 onwards. And in Josiah's system, goods were priced at whatever price the merchant had paid, plus a small surcharge of 4 to 7% to cover store overheads. And the store proved to be modestly successful, operating for 3 years until Warren decided to close it to pursue other goals. In other words, the experimenter long outlived the experiment. And indeed, experiments in time-based currency persist to this day, but all seem to fail without huge investment of effort from community leaders who, like Josiah, soon burn out and move on to pursue other goals, whereupon the experiments always end and people go back to doing things the way they had before. Now, most of you will be much more familiar with the results of historical economic experiment number 3, inspired by a more recent and far more influential economic innovator, Karl Marx, who was a brilliant author and theorist with absolutely no experience of practical governance or apparently any understanding of human nature whatsoever. His communist economic system led to an estimated 80 million deaths through starvation and despotism. And that's equal to the 80 million deaths of the 2 world wars. And that includes deaths from war-related disease and famine. And I think that makes communism the most disastrous economic experiment ever conducted by anyone. And no wonder Winston Churchill, who is a consummate historian and lesson learner, was a bit annoyed with the whole idea. And so Owen, Warren, and Marx and their experiments unintentionally revealed certain enduring truths about what motivates people in economic systems. And I'm going to turn my focus to this topic now. So, as well as talking about these lessons of economic experiments, I'll talk about what we've learned from human motivation research in more recent times. So just in the past few decades, we've really benefited from a huge wealth of rigorous scientific research on the topic. And this is another piece of the picture that sets the scene for my own research on the sharing economy. So psychobiologists and evolutionary theorists such as Richard Dawkins and Robert Trivers have developed notions such as the selfish gene and reciprocity theory to explain human social and economic reasoning and behavior. And they argue convincingly that people's brains are hardwired to generate primarily self-interested behaviors, not behaviors that are purely for the common good. Now, some of you might not believe this of yourselves, but as Robert Trivers points out in his book, The Folly of Fools, self-deceit makes you a better deceiver of other humans who are great lie detectors in pursuit of your own selfish motivations. So even if we are truly convinced we're being caring and altruistic, there's good reason to believe that evolved self-serving instincts can actually explain even our most altruistic of altruistic behaviors, even when we're not aware of them ourselves. And it's not an evolutionary accident that humans don't act like self-centered brutes all the time. We're very prone to be helpful because we evolved to live in families and communities where we depend upon each other to survive. So like many mammals, we're hardwired with the nature to enjoy being helpful to each other because it helps ensure the survival of our own genes to have that tendency. Our ancestors were the ones who found the best balance between selfishness and the advantages of cooperation. So what do we make of those who work tirelessly for others, even as in the case of Florence Nightingale here, to the point of not passing on their own genes? Well, as Abigail Marsh points out in her 2017 book, The Fear Factor, altruistic instincts can trigger some pretty startling non-productive behaviors even amongst animals, such as lionesses adopting baby gazelles in the wild. Now, this makes absolutely no sense from the lioness's survival perspective, but she loves that baby gazelle. She'll even fight off other adult lions in her extended family to protect the calf. You can Google that if you want to know more. And now this is a case of the evolutionarily well-honed and very essential maternal instinct in action, just that the instinct happens to be triggered by the universally appealing cuteness of a baby who happens to be the wrong kind of baby. And so, in a similar way, perfectly sane humans are going to do things, sometimes tremendously altruistic things, that don't help pass on their genes, though the instincts underlying those odd things can always be explained in terms of their advantages for our species in general. Yes, that's a bunch of guys risking their lives to rescue a dog. The same principles of human nature, selfish and selfless, extend to economic exchange, which works for our own self-interest and includes obtaining personal satisfaction from being generous to others, especially when it works to our long-term advantage by adding to our social capital, also known as popularity. Now, my work on the sharing economy has been influenced by a lot of research and theories that try to uncover the nuances of human motivations that underlie the choices we make and behaviors we adopt in our lives. And so I'm going to summarize a few examples of those theories here. Why talk about theories? Well, they turned out to be very helpful in interpreting our own findings when it came time to analyze the data we collected on why people participate in sharing economy systems. So bear with me on the theory here. So perhaps the best known but least empirically grounded theory is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is more or less a kind of common sense appraisal of a variety of needs that seem to motivate people, represented as a pyramid with basic needs at the bottom needing to be satisfied before higher level needs can be addressed. And it's had some criticism for not being very predictive as a theory, but it's intuitively appealing and comprehensive if nothing else. Now, other theories tend to be more specialized to varying degrees in terms of the kind of motivations they consider. And some of you might have read this book by Daniel Pink, Drive, which focuses on mainly what motivates people in the workplace and other sort of practical spheres. And he's one of many advocates of the idea that self-determination, the ability to control your own destiny, is extremely important to people, and that extrinsic rewards, such as money, actually undermine people's motivation to do things for their own value, their own sake. So Pink based a lot of his thinking on the work of Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, and they found that money can really change our attitude to what we're doing and turn it into a chore. And they demonstrated this way back in the early 70s when they showed that experimental participants who were invited to play with something called a Soma Cube puzzle as an experimental session, they'd continue to play with it of their own volition during a break, apparently because it was entertaining in its own sake. But if they paid participants to play with the very same puzzle, those people would immediately stop playing with it during the break, and they could only conclude that the puzzle had lost its intrinsic appeal purely because of the payment. That was the only thing that was different. So based on these kinds of observations, Deci and Ryan developed self-determination theory, arguing that for someone to become intrinsically motivated to do something, they need to feel that they're in charge of their own destiny, and money takes away that sense of autonomy, as do many other carrots and sticks that are used to control people's behaviors. Things that motivate people to believe a bit more in what they're doing than money carrots are, for example, tokens that reinforce one's sense of competence, like badges or awards, and then ideals or causes that one can believe in greatly increase one's internalization of the value of a behavior. But the best motivator of all is learning that there's immediate gratification to be had from doing something that you find to be engaging or enjoyable. And so the trick is to help people find satisfaction in accomplishing something that gives them a sense of autonomy and self-worth. Another theory of motivation more connected with behavior change is Icek Asjan's theory of planned behavior. And this theory assumes that there's a behavior you're engaging in that isn't so good, such as eating too many cookies or lounging on the sofa watching TV and not exercising, or camping out on Facebook during working hours. And such behavior is somewhat addictive and challenging to avoid due to the fact that it has short-term appeal. It tends to form a habit that you can't get out of, and there are social circumstances, such as the fact that everyone else is doing it, or at least no one else seems to disapprove. And so Asjan argues that the key is to work on building up people's intentionality. So the theory of planned behavior was developed as a framework for helping health professionals and coaches help us to sidestep intrinsic motivations to engage in behaviors that are not so good for us by modifying the beliefs that we have about such behaviors our beliefs about how acceptable other people find the behavior as a norm, and our beliefs about our own ability to control the behavior. And once you shift those beliefs, then you can more easily form better intentions to engage in more healthy or productive behaviors. So this theory is used quite well in changing health, financial, sustainable, and altruistic kinds of behaviors. Another theory developed by Robert Trivers that I mentioned before is reciprocity theory, or reciprocal altruism, or essentially, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, or you pick my lice and I'll pick yours if you're a chimp. And the reciprocity rule appears to describe an evolved instinct that is very deeply ingrained in our nature, and it can be observed at work in humans and many other animals' daily social life in many big and small ways. And I really like this cartoon as an illustration of the very serious implications of the breach of the reciprocity rule, that when somebody does something for you, you must at least acknowledge their kindness, or better yet, return the favor, or there may be trouble. I'm sure everyone in this room has no trouble recognizing this feeling. Such is the power of this instinct. Yet another theory of motivation, I think this is the last one, it's social exchange theory, which most closely corresponds to what Adam Smith was talking about in his books. And it proposes that people are operating in terms of rational self-interest when they engage in social and economic interactions. We're, of course, bounded by the limits of our rationality or irrationality, but essentially, we always make a what's in it for me calculation based on a comparison of the anticipated costs and rewards involved in any transaction. And the theory notes that rewards of the same kind tend to lose their perceived value the more of them we have. After all, one new car, or one new diamond ring, or one carrot may be lovely, but how about 2 or 3 or 100? In general, the more of any good you have, the less you value each additional unit. So social exchange theory would predict that people constantly search for economic opportunities that offer the greatest returns of the most highly prized, usually the most scarce resources, for the least amount of effort. Once they have enough of any commodity, they tend to focus on other rewards. And this is why barter economic systems tended to work in the past, as one person's useless excess of carrots could be exchanged with a carrotless person for anything more useful that person had to offer. Okay, so we've done a whirlwind tour of theories of motivation. And I think all this rigorous intellectual work shows that motivation is starting to be somewhat understood by scientists. And now it's time to think about how motivation interacts with our economic system and examine the causes of the financial crash that turbocharged the recent emergence of the sharing economy innovations. So yes, let's go back to money again. So Kathleen Vose is a distinguished professor at the University of Minnesota, and she and her collaborators showed in a series of shocking experiments that just by exposing people to the idea of lots of money, which is what I'm doing to you now with this slide, you can influence them to be more accepting of the inequalities of society, less likely to ask for help, less likely to give help, even when helping incurs little effort or no skill, and less likely to want to associate with other people at leisure and in work. And you can look up Google Kathleen Vose 2006 if you want to learn more about these experiments. They're really surprising. And the implication of her findings is that having seen this slide, you should now be only half as helpful to others as you were before you saw it. Let's introduce another important kind of human trait, which came up earlier when I was talking about the theory of planned behavior. Now, we all like to fit in, and we use other individuals' behavior as a very strong cue to what we should do, or at least what we can get away with. Social scientists like to call this social proof, and it's a major motivator for human behavior. And this tendency was demonstrated by Solomon Asch's 1956 studies of independence and conformity. He ran an experiment where each member of a group was asked to say aloud which of the lines on the right matched the length of that on the left. All but one, the subject, were actors who gave the same obviously correct answer in the control condition, and in the experimental condition, they all gave the wrong answer. In the control condition with no weird actor answers, the error rate on the task was less than 1%. But in the crazy actor condition, where everybody gave the wrong answer, 34% of the subjects conformed to the actor's obviously incorrect answer. When they were interviewed afterwards, it was found that people did so for a variety of reasons, not necessarily because they lost their mind and agreed with the crazy answer, but mainly it seemed that these folks just wanted to fit in. So now let's consider what powerful self-interested motivations, combined with the prospect of lots of money floating around and an instinct for conformity, what do these things bring about in an under-regulated financial market? Well, as we know, back in the mid-2000s, complex financial instruments became so popular amongst investment companies that huge market risks were built up and were simply ignored. Financial professionals report that it was hard to resist the pressure from their stakeholders and managers to join in the trade frenzy with the promise of huge financial gains, even if they could see the risks themselves. Whether it was due to self-interest or to social pressure from peers and management, herds of people who should have known better collectively lost their minds, overextended their company's debt obligations without adequate backing, and in 2008 plunged the world economy into the greatest financial crisis since the 1929 stock market collapse. It turned out that most of the developed world was caught up in the foolishness. This Wikipedia picture shows which countries were hit and how badly. Red is bad and darker red is worse. Southern European countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, collectively and disparagingly referred to as the pigs, were amongst the hardest hit by the crisis. In response to the economic meltdown, they were forced to begin many experiments in economics and community action, in particular creating their own alternative currencies, backed by labor and other assets on hand. And in this way, they were actually able to restart some of the economic activity that had been choked off by lack of access to conventional cash. With this bleak historical backdrop, it's not surprising then that a lot of people were concerned about their own financial security and waste of resources. And social scientists such as Professor Paul Piff at UC Irvine on the right here have studied the effects of this sense of insecurity, finding that it makes people more empathetic of others in need. So as a mirror to the money research by Kathleen Vose and her colleagues, it seems that when people are concerned about their own financial insecurity and they're not being mesmerized by the prospect of huge piles of cash in their future, they become more generous, considerate, and collaborative. So by 2008, the scene was now set for an explosion of economic experiments in how we might do a better job of conserving precious resources. And in this talk, I've done my best to set the scene for what I'm about to examine, which is what we came to refer to as the sharing economy. And if you recall, this came to prominence around 2010, although things were starting before then, and it was accompanied by a lot of media excitement about the technology-enabled power of peer-to-peer marketplaces. It was associated with ideals of generosity and sustainability, and so this kind of image is what you'll see if you Google sharing economy and this sort of thing. And this, which is a warm, fuzzy image, rather like Lyft's cuddly car stash. And Lyft is just one of many, many sharing economy startups that came around 2010 and soon after. And 2010 was the year that Rachel Botsman and Rue Rogers published this book, What's Mine is Yours, The Rise of Collaborative Consumption, which helped to popularize the idea that new startups offering peer-to-peer marketplace platforms were an exploding, disruptive phenomenon, unlocking a vast potential to make better use of the resources humans are sucking out of the planet. As Paul Piff would predict, our collective terror of financial collapse and our own personal chances of financial ruin did appear to make each of us feel more empathetic and generous. And the argument for resource sharing is really compelling. If we in the developed world keep consuming as we are, how many times the resources of the planet would we need? Some countries are not using too much, but the more developed countries are going at a completely unsustainable pace. And we need the resources of lots of planet Earth to keep going if everyone was behaving the same way as the US and the United Arab Emirates, as this excellent BBC graphic shows. So this all brings me to how I got involved in sharing economy research. In 2011, I was working at the Palo Alto Research Center, commonly referred to as PARC, and I was doing full-time research for commercial and government clients, and I attended a workshop funded by the United States National Science Foundation, or NSF, organized by Gilly Leschard and her colleagues. And Gilly invited me as a speaker on task management, which had been the focus of my work for about 8 years up to 2007. And interestingly, this one invitation and my resulting workshop participation changed the course of my professional career, leading to where I am now at Lyft. So at the workshop, in a small breakout, I got into an excellent discussion with the wonderful Professor John Carroll at Penn State University. And our discussion inspired a proposal to the NSF to research how technology might help busy people offload their tasks onto those with time on their hands. After a couple of years, we brought in Professor Anin Day at Carnegie Mellon University, now at the University of Washington, for his expertise in context-aware and mobile computing, which we needed to complete this technology vision. So the vision and the work plan, ultimately funded by the NSF, was to use context-aware computing to match people to tasks based on skills and convenience, so that the task performer who had the right skills should be in the right place at the right time to perform the task most conveniently. And that implies a need to track and eventually predict where people are going to be so that they can be matched to task requests when they happen. We needed a community of users that would take to this idea and luckily discovered time banking, which is a revival of Josiah Warren's concept of a currency backed by labor hours, which had taken off after the economic collapse, especially in Southern Europe, where, as I said earlier, conventional money was severely lacking and time banking systems started making the news because they were helping to keep things going. So in time banks, people provide services to each other, and instead of exchanging money, they exchange time dollars. So for example, someone can do 1 hour of babysitting and use that to buy, and that time dollar to buy an hour of gardening from someone else, and so on. And time banks became popular in places where many people did not have job opportunities, but through time banks could still use their skills to provide services and also receive the services they needed. So we partnered with the wonderful people of Our World, a large community-based time banking network based in the USA, and Terry Daniels, Linda Hogan, Stephen Beckett, and John Saar were the leaders that worked with us. And Our World provided a web-based software platform engineered by Steve and John and others for posting offers and requests and tracking exchanges of time dollars in exchange for services. But as our research got underway, we soon found that most people were drawn to this example of a sharing economy platform service by down-to-earth self-serving motivations, such as convenience and earning or saving money, as well as the appeal of a friendly social interaction. In interviews and a survey, we found that organizers had idealistic motivations for participation, such as sharing, caring, and sustainability. But by contrast, the rank and file members had these self-serving motives like earning currency or getting affordable services. So in the figure on the left here, you can see data from a survey covering the different motives of members and organizers. And that gave us the chi-squared statistic at the top, which shows the difference between the two groups' motives is statistically significant. Meanwhile, the right-hand figure shows how the existing platform's inability to match people's offers and requests automatically tended to lead to a drop-off in usage of the time bank just for the rank and file members. It was too much work to keep browsing the site for matching offers and requests, resulting in these members leaving the platform. And our NSF-funded system was intended to do this matching automatically to make the experience much better for everyone. And I just want to give thanks to Patrick Shee here, who led this analysis, and you can find his work and mine, actually, in the ACM Digital Library. If you Google his name and mine, that's Patrick S-H-I-H, and the paper's title starts with Unequal Time for Unequal Value, if you're interested. And you can come and ask me about it later. We wondered if the dominance of self-serving motivations was true of the so-called sharing economy as a whole. So we decided to interview users and platform providers of sharing economy startups, large and small, about motivations for participation. This is not one of my team members, by the way. I just wanted to emphasize that the data collection method was to interview people over Skype, for the most part, although a few of our interviews were in person, but we always wore our pants when we did those interviews. So we followed a semi-structured interview guide that was designed to take people back through the customer journey of the particular sharing economy service they had used or had helped to develop, and ask about motivations for everything from signing up to engaging in transactions to encouraging other people to join. For end users, clearly it was their own motivations that we were interested in, but for the marketplace providers who were founders of little startups or employees of bigger startups, we asked them about what they thought motivated their users, not themselves, their users, and how they designed their services to motivate these people to participate. We conducted 68 interviews, and this is a breakout of the kinds of services included in the study. And where there are 4 or more interviews, I'm showing examples, but the smaller services, they had just, a few employees and one interviewee. I'm not showing the company names for anonymity reasons. And so here's some examples of the sorts of things users who received goods or services, service receivers or goods receivers on a peer-to-peer economy platform would say. So, for example, Lyft. It's fast, friendly, and easy, and the alternative is so much worse, The taxi environment isn't as nice. The Portland Time Bank. We found out it's going to cost $300, a professional person coming, so I could give them hours instead of money. And FreeCycle. When you hear your friend talking about getting something for free, you're like, hey, that's cool. I want to join that. And Airbnb. It was really the financial aspect. I can get a room to stay in for like 50% of the price, so I might as well do it. And then here's some quotes from users who provided goods and services on these platforms. So Repair Cafe, where people fix other people's broken stuff. There's a feeling of satisfaction fixing things. It makes people really happy when you fix their things. Flight Car, where you park your car at the airport and it gets rented out. In the moment that I signed up, it was definitely like, I need to park my car somewhere, and this is a much cheaper option. Uber, okay, I have a few hours right now, I'm going to drive people around for a low cost, and it could make me minimum wage at least. And Kiva, a feeling of, this is where you donate to small businesses, it's a feeling of community that giving forward and giving them something they need, that's basically what you get. And then look at what the providers were claiming about their users' motives. And this is a bit of mind reading on their part, and I had to keep these a bit more anonymous, but see how the quality is a bit different. Somebody who does groceries doesn't want to carry a big amount of groceries, and maybe they don't have a car, so they order groceries through us so that they had less travel and more time. The transition to a greater global social impact that we fulfill because people don't really want to see their money go into like big chains. The bottom left, that is really actually a transformative experience for people that once they have, they're not necessarily willing to let go. And the bottom right, as long as people are buying, that means people are selling, and if people are selling, they're happy. And then this is platform providers talking about how their systems had been designed to promote their ideals by motivating collaboration, sharing, and sustainable practices. So top right, make sure the people understand that other people are having fun here and maybe they want to come to the party. And top left, it was really about contributing back to the community and helping to rebuild community, that type of messaging. Bottom right, by appealing to their philanthropic nature, so you join, you contribute, you create a better system that's sustainable, etc. So presenting things like that. and then getting them rewards when they do join. And finally, what we're trying to do is burn this notion of repair and reuse into the brains of people. Okay, so we had a lot of quotes like that, and to code them all, we created an extensive theory-driven framework of different possible motivators from basic practical needs at the bottom here, through inherent enjoyment in the middle, to more empathetic or social or even higher societal motivations, all the way up to morality-based ideals. And this framework is drawn directly from those theories I talked about earlier and more. And please don't read anything into the vertical order in which things are placed. That's not meaningful in any way, and it's just vaguely based on Maslow's hierarchy. Just notice that there are many different types of possible motivation here, and we were intent on looking for them in what people told us about why they use these systems or how they designed them to work. And we coded in terms of as many kinds of motivation for participation as each quote implied, with at least 2 coders determining the coding and with the team reviewing and checking the codes for agreement. It's a very complicated and lengthy process. The quotes were also coded according to whether they came from users talking about receiving goods and services, and users talking about providing them, or employees or founders of peer-to-peer services talking about what they believed motivated their users and what motivation they said they designed their systems to encourage. And we can think of these as 4 perspectives, each of which is represented by a column here, and each column indicates how often a motivation is mentioned relative to other possible motivations for each perspective. So the cells represent the frequency of mention expressed as a percentage of the most frequent count for that column. So 100%, which is the deepest red, was the most frequently mentioned motivation for that perspective column. Now, to review our findings from this summary visualization. So what everyone seems to agree on is the importance of the social element of peer-to-peer economy systems. Only one of the previous studies of peer economies we reviewed before our analysis actually agreed with this. So this is a sort of fairly good newish contribution that we found that, yes, the social aspect is especially important. And that's especially true actually where money is not involved. The biggest finding, though, is this obvious misalignment of the motivations expressed from the different perspectives. The most important motivation that system providers talk about designing for at the top seems to be society, community, utopia. And if we hadn't broken out sustainability as a separate category, it would have been by far the most important. And notice how the platform provider's enthusiasm up there is not matched on the same row by corresponding enthusiasm from the users. The users are focused on the instrumental rewards, such as getting paid, down at the bottom there, whilst the providers, who from their corresponding rows do seem to understand their users want practical benefits, didn't seem to be saying much about how they had designed their systems to prioritize this most important kind of motivation. Even when we dug deeper and broke our data out, so we separated out and looked just at for-profits, non-profits, altruistic, and non-altruistic services, this misalignment remained in the data. So user receivers seem to be mainly motivated by the prospect of getting the services and things they needed, especially if there's added value. On the user provider side, the picture's a bit more complicated, including some altruism, but still, after the social aspects, the second motivation overall is payment, which includes alternative currency or credits as well as money. And there's also the incentive of interest and engagement of participation. But we still don't see an overwhelming desire to build a better utopian community. Apart from utopian ideals, providers did talk about the idea that their users would want to help each other. But surprisingly, they didn't seem to talk so much about designing their services to specifically encourage altruistic helping motivations. So what can we infer from all of this? Well, our data suggests that it was never really the sharing that drew most people into the peer-to-peer economy. It was the competitive usefulness and value that companies provided that mattered. Many of the startup founders were, like Robert Owen, misguided philanthropic idealists running economic experiments that ignored the wisdom of Adam Smith, documented at length hundreds of years before. And so I believe this can at least partially explain why today most of the companies that mushroomed up in the late 2000s in the sharing economy explosion are gone. They simply weren't competitive and couldn't withstand the irresistible force of Adam Smith's invisible hand. More speculatively, I think the initial flush of enthusiasm and apparent success had something to do with people temporarily being more mindful of the threat of personal financial failure after the stock market collapse. And so they were collectively feeling more altruistic towards their fellow human beings as a result. But the conventional economy soon recovered, and so it seems did people's collective sense of self-sufficiency and their primary focus on earning money again. And I think Kathleen Vose and Paul Piff, whom I mentioned earlier, would probably agree that this increasing sense of affluence could explain diminishing motivations to try to participate in altruistic economic experiments. If you want to read about this work, you can find it in the ACM Digital Library. Just Google my name and a muddle of models of motivation, and you'll find it pretty easily. And I'll take this opportunity to thank my collaborators for their hard work in helping to get this research done. And so where are we now? Well, as you know, some of the so-called sharing economy companies became huge. So eBay, Airbnb, Uber, and now Lyft. And they did so by competing against conventional economy businesses and beating them on their own terms. And that means simply appealing to people's desire to increase personal benefits with more cost-effective services and new opportunities to make money. My own idealism about altruism received a severe dent when I tried and failed in 2017 to recruit volunteers to try a transportation task app that I was talking about, funded by the NSF, that we built to help seniors and others in need of rides and deliveries. It dawned on me that the only ones who seemed to be enthusiastic about this app were the ones who were going to be benefiting from the free rides and deliveries. And the volunteers that we were looking for to provide these services, they were just not to be found. But this was at the same time that the economy was recovering, and altruism seemed to be taking a back seat behind more self-interested motivations to earn money, while the opportunities were rapidly increasing. And I'm not being critical here, it's just that people with grueling full-time jobs don't have the time or energy to volunteer. And so, yes, I was no smarter than those failed entrepreneurs, or they were no stupider than I am. Anyway, without funding running out, my research on the sharing economy began wrapping up in 2017, and I decided it was time to leave research and get out there to work for a successful sharing economy service provider, but at least one with the definite aim to improve the world. Since my previous project had largely focused on transportation tasks as an application domain, Lyft was the natural place to move to. By contrast with Uber, Lyft espoused more of the ideals that I share of sustainable transportation and continues to do so. And I was hired in March of this year as a user experience researcher, and I've been working on growth, shared rides, and autonomous vehicles, various things since then. And I want to explain now why it is that I feel so fortunate to work at a company like Lyft. And I apologize for sounding like a bit of a cheerleader here. Lyft's two founders, Logan Green and John Zimmer, CEO and president, are both super chaps. They're huge believers in sustainable transportation, as well as running a company with really high standards of workplace ethics that fully supports a diverse workforce. And one of their major objectives for Lyft is to become the industry leader in sustainable transportation. So they want to take us from here to here. And although we associate Lyft with cars, Lyft is in negotiations to acquire Motivate, a bike share company that operates many of the largest bike share systems in North America. In fact, 80% of the bike share trips in 2017 in the United States were on Motivate-operated systems. And the demand for bike share and the potential to serve even more Americans with this mode of transportation is very clear. And as you can see from this shot of our website, we're also integrating scooter sharing into the app as well, with an initial release in Denver, Colorado, followed by Santa Monica, California, and Washington, D.C., and there are applications ongoing for permits and subsequent introductions, hopefully in cities across the country, and we're actually building the scooters ourselves. In another effort to promote sustainable travel, Lyft has also made it easier to compare prices of its solo versus shared rides. The new selection screen with the cheaper shared option visible right below the classic option has apparently prompted a 5% increase in choosing a shared ride. To further promote shared rides, Lyft will notify those who opt to have a single ride solo if there's an available shared ride heading their way that doesn't include any detours. So the ultimate goal is to get more people in a smaller number of cars. In fact, Lyft has set a goal to achieve 50% shared rides by the end of 2020. And it's also launching transit integration with the app. For example, we're currently integrated with the Transportation Authority of Marin, California, and the Big Blue Bus in Santa Monica, as well as services in LA, California. In total, Lyft has more than 25 transit partners throughout the country, and we're increasing that number. And the idea is that people will be able to get public transit trip details and plan their entire trip from within the Lyft app. And Lyft is also going to offer Lyft discounts to people who use bikes and scooters to connect to transit, and is also experimenting with paying people in Lyft credits to give up their car altogether. So Lyft is doing what it can to counteract our addiction to car ownership and usage, anything to bring down the price and increase sustainability by reducing vehicle miles per person, even whilst increasing mobility. And so you can expect to see an ongoing increase in the number and efficiency of sustainable options over the next few years. And this is a screenshot from Lyft's blog in September, which talks about another Lyft sustainability initiative called Green Cities. This is a new business unit dedicating significant resources to tackling climate change to maximize the positive impact of the Lyft platform. And I'm summarizing some of the blog post here. So the company created a carbon offset program, a multi-million-dollar investment in 2018 alone, to ensure that all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. And the blog also announced that Lyft is now purchasing enough carbon offsets to neutralize the remainder of the company's emissions, making Lyft a fully carbon neutral company. And what about those forgotten appendages dangling from your hips? Well, Lyft is now suggesting more convenient pickup locations and drop-offs because a little walking won't kill you, but it can significantly reduce detours and traffic congestion that is caused by cars having to travel to individual pickup and drop-offs. Never mind the fact that this makes sharing your ride less attractive because of all of the little detours that you have to make to do this. Walking to a more efficient pickup or drop-off is not just good for the environment, it's really good for you. And research shows that just 30 minutes of walking 5 days a week is enough to save $2,500 a year in the US on cardiovascular medical costs. What's not to like about that? And for those people whose health is not so good, Lyft is trying to help them too. And so apparently 3.6 million Americans miss or delay medical care each year because of transportation issues. And Lyft is committed to halving that number by 2020. Of course, patients can order rides for themselves, but we can't expect that of everyone, especially the elderly who need healthcare the most. So Lyft has teamed up with healthcare partners to improve access to care by providing concierge accounts to those partners. So, for example, American Medical Response and its business unit Access to Care are working with Lyft to offer alternative transportation options for routine medical care to thousands of Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries. And the Concierge API allows those large clients to schedule a trip for a customer with just one click. Okay, that's all about healthy people. What about healthy democracy? Well, it's estimated that over 15 million people in the US were registered but didn't vote in 2016 because of transportation issues. As we all know, there's a sad tendency for in the US for voters in some areas, especially underprivileged ones, to be short on supply of nearby polling stations. And that's why Lyft is committed to providing 50% off rides to vote across the country and free rides to underserved communities that face significant obstacles to transportation. In order to uphold its commitment to inclusivity, Lyft is also supporting 50 nonprofits around the country that provide high-quality local support to immigrants and refugees and victims of domestic abuse, with relief rides to those in need. So this commitment to community care and sustainability is why I was so excited to join Lyft in March of this year. And now I want to conclude this presentation, finally, by thinking about the challenges of trying to innovate and do good at scale in a sustainable way. And that means you have to create a competitive sharing economy company that, despite its good intentions, has to be tough enough to survive the pressures of challenging market forces. And it has to have a value proposition of disrupting inefficient transportation that is attractive to both investors and users, that is not dependent solely on the idealistic belief that people will choose sharing and global sustainability over financial and convenience imperatives. And so if you've learned anything from my talk so far, I hope you'll be convinced by now that people will not do that. And so this is a bit like dealing with Adam Smith's invisible hand in a really hard metal gauntlet. So you probably know that at the start of the Industrial Revolution, economic forces drove skilled textile workers in the UK to rebel and smash newfangled disruptive spinning and weaving machines in protest over the loss of their livelihoods. And these machines were built or purchased by manufacturers who used them together with cheaper, unskilled labor to outcompete the old ways of manufacturing cloth. And you couldn't succeed as a business owner if you went on doing things the old way when your competitors were undercutting you with their new, more cost-efficient manufacturing technology platform. And that never-ending competitive economic force is why we all wear machine-made clothing today and don't spend most of our time tending sheep, spinning yarn from their fleece, and weaving clothes for ourselves and our community members. And the same kinds of harsh, implacable market forces are at work now on the rocky road towards a more efficient transportation marketplace. We see scary obstacles such as uproar about taxi businesses being hit hard and cities struggling to evolve and adapt along with the changes being brought about by these new private innovators. But transportation cannot reverse itself back to the old days. And it's going to be up to the innovators, urged on by competition, to modernize and diversify into more efficient and convenient transportation options while competing to survive. And some aspects of transportation might even get worse before they get better, while the kinks in new transportation ecologies are worked out and our personal habits and our built infrastructure evolve to accommodate more sustainable transportation solutions. I promise I'm very close to the end here. And yes, we recognize that older transportation business models are being displaced. Unfortunately, those business models, like all business models, are being challenged by multiple new developments over the time. And no enterprise is immune to this force for change, not even Lyft. In the meantime, we're trying to do as much as we can to help drivers make money, providing them better and better information on where to go to get rides through our app, committing $100 million in funding for cheaper oil changes, basic car maintenance, service car washes, and more. And Lyft recently almost doubled operating hours at driver hubs in 15 cities throughout the nation to provide assistance to drivers in those areas. Now, you might have heard about New York's recent move to push drivers' incomes up, in part by capping the number of rideshare vehicles, which means that passengers then have fewer options to travel in safety and comfort, avoiding the crush on public transit. As a result, they're going to be less motivated to give up their private car if they can afford one. And if you can afford to buy a car, you're naturally tempted to use it all the time. Meanwhile, research out of UCLA in 2016 by Anne E. Brown and my own research at Lyft confirms that many riders use Lyft because they can't afford a car and because public transport doesn't go when and where they need it to. For example, a warehouse where they work at night in a dangerous neighborhood. So helping individual drivers by limiting their number and mandating higher fares can hurt passengers. All these conflicting considerations highlight the fact that rideshare marketplaces are subject to irreconcilable tensions between passengers' desire or even desperate need for cheap, flexible transportation and the driver's need for a reasonable income. Simply raising prices to pay drivers more risks making a competitor uncompetitive, and when you think about it, risks attracting more drivers into the marketplace, reducing the number of passenger rides available to each driver. And that's why New York had to both raise driver pay and limit the number of drivers, resulting in higher prices for passengers. So it's a really challenging balancing act. So whilst Lyft's founders are committed to the long-term goal of sustainability, market forces don't make it easy to bring this about. And there's strong competition from Uber and other companies driving down prices while local governments are thinking about slowing the disruption, limiting vehicles, and enforcing minimum driver payments. And this is a very difficult environment to survive in, and success is not guaranteed. It's very hard to predict how things are going to work out, even over the next few years, never mind for the long run. But this evolutionary pressure means that players in the industry are highly motivated in their own self-interest to be the most efficient service possible. And this is Adam Smith's invisible hand at work at the company level. So, to bring this talk to a close, this is the last slide. I suppose what we've really been trying to tell you throughout is that I'm an idealist who loved the idea of the Weconomy, but has learned to be a realist about the inevitability of the Meconomy imperatives as well. And I know that whatever high-level goal we may have to change the world's economy for the better, it's not going to be an easy task. Yes, there is kindness and altruism in almost everyone, but we have to face the reality that our economic innovations must be self-sustaining in a brutally competitive world where everyone is mostly in it for him or herself first and foremost. So there's a lot of hard work on the road ahead if we want to encourage people to switch over to more sustainable transportation. But at Lyft, I'm participating in an endeavor with a lofty vision that I can really get behind. And that, as so many theorists of human motivation would have predicted, sustains me and keeps me going at work, especially because the user experience research that I do for Lyft really is intrinsically interesting and deeply fulfilling. And that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, for an inspiring talk. And we'll have time for questions and answers. I'll just switch to Portuguese for a minute. Era para eu ter avisado que tinha papéis passando, que vocês podiam ter feito perguntas e mandado aqui para frente, mas ainda tem. Mas a gente tem espaço para perguntas pessoalmente, e quem preferir fazer no papel e mandar, pode também, tá? So we have time for questions now. And who would like to start?
Hi, Victoria. Thank you for a very inspiring talk. And I was really impressed by the breadth of the perspective that you take at Lyft in trying to compose a very complex picture of all the forces that are in place and how you must navigate this space where you go, you know, not from me economy to we economy, but where you sort of live with that. And you have talked about the invisible hand of the market, right? And it struck me that, you know, most of the experiments that you have mentioned, I don't know if I'm right, if I got it right, but it seemed to me that they have been run in the US and that you have 15 cities in the US, et cetera. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the invisible hand of culture?
Are you going to repeat it in Portuguese, or shall I just
fire
away? Okay. Yeah, no, I actually think that it's a culture-free phenomenon. I think it's universal across cultures. I do think that different governments take a different stance on how much regulation there is, and sometimes regulation can be a really good thing. Too little of it, and you wind up with what happened in 2007, 2008, with nobody apparently minding the circus that was going on in the stock market. Other countries, take a very firm hand and have a lot more regulation. I think Europe is much stronger on regulation in a lot of areas. Other countries are, try to control everything, but then you tend to end up with a lot of corruption. So, there's a lot of delicate balance and ways that things can go wrong and be non-ideal in these different countries. And I don't know whether it's necessarily cultural so much as political, and about who, what political hegemony has the upper hand at any given time and how they decide to manage the situation. But over the ages, I think, this phenomenon of the invisible hand and people sort of, essentially going about their business day to day and trying to make a success of their business by building a good reputation, abiding by moral standards, and therefore being trusted by others to be dealt with. I think that sort of transcends individual cultures, and I think it's sort of a human trait. It seems to be something that must have spread from the Fertile Crescent with human culture, back from millennia ago. I mean, I'm not a theorist on the deep history of economic behavior, but I do think that it's not just, a Western cultural thing or an East versus West thing. It's definitely very common, and the fact that Adam Smith was so able to call out something that still is so true today just says to me that he was observing things that are pretty similar phenomena.
Yes, so my name is Kristina Höök. I'm from Sweden. I live just outside Stockholm. And Sweden is one of those European countries that is very regulated, and so the market is kept under control in certain ways. And of course that's always a difficult issue, but it's also sometimes a way that it works. So I was just sitting here thinking about Lyft and thinking about what Stockholm is doing instead of promoting more taxis. And that is the public transportation system. So we made it very expensive to drive your car into Stockholm, and there are many reasons for that. Stockholm is built on islands, there are very few bridges, and so you don't want a lot of cars in the city center. So parking your car in Stockholm is very expensive. Going through the toll system is also not super expensive, but it costs a little bit of money. And then there's a lot of money put to actually building trains and buses and whatnot to create a public transportation system. And given, global warming and so on, I just feel like, well, isn't this the way we should be heading? Shouldn't we be thinking really carefully about how to regulate these markets, how to sort of balance your self-interest? I just want to add one more thing, and that there is a lovely, lovely study that shows that in a society that is not regulated, where there are huge differences between the rich and the poor, everybody suffers. Everybody has more illnesses and so on, the rich people included, because they live in fear. And that is not good for a primate that enjoys being with other primates. And so, again, why Lyft? Why not public transportation? Why didn't you work for the municipality instead?
That's a great question, Christina. I have to point out that unfortunately the United States, I think it's a well-known sort of secret that the US car manufacturers did everything that they had in their power to destroy public transportation a long time ago. And we're suffering ever since. Another thing is the idea of the American dream, which has led to horrendous urban sprawl. So, in Europe, cities tend to be people clustered much closer together. The design of housing, terraced housing, or apartment blocks are much more popular in Europe. In America, it's each little house, on its own plot of land, hugely spread out, which just means everything is really, really far apart. And so that just means that in order to go to the corner store, you have to drive. I mean, because the corner store doesn't exist. I can remember visiting America maybe the second time and asking somebody, where's the nearest drugstore? And they said, oh, it's just about 6 miles up the road. And I was horrified because in London, where I came from, you can usually walk to it, So you can't exist in the US without a car. And I think it's a terrible shame, and I think it's very foolish the way that we've been left with this total dependence on transportation, and it has to be motorized transportation. I just wish that we could get down to smaller vehicles, but Americans, even with the price of fuel going up, you know, they keep wanting to go back to bigger and bigger vehicles and bigger houses. And yeah, I know, I totally agree with you. I think it's a shame, but that's the way we are. And Lyft is doing what they can to get people to use bicycles and scooters, but even that, you know, it has its own challenges because the streets are not so safe for bicycles and scooters in America.
We've received the question here that says that there are several critics to sharing economy regarding the labor aspects. For instance, you have cheap labor and no worker rights. Did you observe that in the interviews? How does Lyft deal with that?
Say that again. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes, several critics to sharing economy regarding the labor aspects. For instance, that drivers will have a cheap labor or they won't have any worker rights. Mm-hmm. So if you observe any of that in the interviews that you made or concerns about that, and how does Lyft deal with that?
Yeah, there's all sorts of tough issues here about, you know, the how this has come about, that, you know, there's a lot of uproar about, you know, what are the rights of drivers. And so the whole premise of these businesses, in fact, the whole of the peer-to-peer economy, was about creating a platform for what we called micro-entrepreneurs. And so the idea is that anybody could just provide their own service on these platforms. And the platforms that succeeded were just Airbnb, eBay, and Uber and Lyft. And so now they stand out as these odd companies. And in the case of these driver platforms, it looks like a taxi company, you know, but it was started on the premise of being a platform for micro-entrepreneurs to do their thing. What has happened, though, is that drivers don't earn a huge amount of money on average because there's enough people attracted into doing driving that you end up with, you know, a lot of drivers, and then they don't have rides all the time. And this is part of that marketplace balance issue again, you know, is like, how do you make sure that drivers, you know, have what they need to succeed? And so, you know, it's not really something that we control, and Lyft and Uber can't afford to make all of these people their employees. That would end these businesses right away. I mean, that, you know, they're just not built on that premise. It's a different kind of premise to which a lot of cities are now trying to sort of figure out, well, how can we make sure that these people get, you know, more money? And that's based on the taxi model. And in the taxi model, I think that was probably kind of a weird situation that was created by the price of medallions, you know, that drivers actually would spend, I think in New York, over $1 million buying a medallion, buying the right. It was like buying a house or a mortgage, and you had to earn a lot of money to pay that off. And very rich people started buying these medallions and holding them as investments and lending them to people. It created this very strange situation. And now, you know, like people sort of compare what taxi drivers were getting with what these drivers are getting, but these drivers are not paying off these giant mortgages for these medallions, which, you know, the traditional taxi drivers are now stuck in this awful situation, which, you know, is created by an unintended consequence of regulation, in fact, with the medallions. So, yeah, awkward situation and unintended consequences.
Okay, we have a question in the back.
Working? Oh. Thanks, Victoria. It was a very nice presentation. Thanks for the carrots. Now I'm going to be nailing smarter to my friends.
Thank you. Yes. So, come up here and get your carrots.
So my question is more of an opinion based about 3 different aspects, not necessarily relating to the sharing economy, but the thing that made the sharing economy possible, the internet. Let's look at 3 services. For an example, have you ever heard of Fiverr?
I've heard of Fiverr, but I'm totally not remembering what it was.
It's basically like a Netflix of services where everyone gets paid $5, and they often do an easy job like singing happy birthday to someone or
Right.
or drawing something or whatever, $5 for it.
Yeah.
And there is also YouTube, which is sharing ideas. It's whether or not it's also kind of part of a sharing economy, and people get paid for that. And Facebook is also starting that. Basically, I want you to look at these two. Like, one is a Netflix of services that people share, get paid, and kind of have been overworking to death. Another is kind of a mess right now, where YouTube people are trying to make a living with their content, but at the same time, because my content may be a bit too spicy for the roast, people just don't want to pay me for it. I guess the main point is, what checks the sharing economy? What keeps watching it, making sure it works? Is it just people by people, or is there more to this invisible hand, something even more tangible that we just feel, that we have to understand more of the human nature and the economic nature, as well as the politics and people around us, to make it work? Because it's almost like trust-based economics even.
Yeah, I think going back to Adam Smith, I mean, he was talking about, both morality and self-interest as sort of like the two sides of human nature, and you had to have morality to keep self-interest in check. And so you're supposed to have your own sort of moral conscience keeping your own behavior in check, but if you misbehave, then the people that you transact with are likely to also create consequences for you. Either they disconnect from you, or they downrate you, or they, destroy your reputation and spread the word that you're a bad actor. And then if that doesn't succeed, of course, then, we rely on the regulators, and then the regulators may be the platform provider itself, which often, they're loath to step in because they don't want to be seen as manipulating what's going on, because it's often seen as a negative thing, that, they're doing this for some nefarious, evil reason. Facebook is trying to control the people's view of reality, things like that. So they're very careful about that, and they were very slow to react when they found that their platforms were being abused in 2016 for the presidential election. For that very reason. And then obviously then we rely on government, and some governments, as we talked about, are much less willing to create laws than others to anticipate and prevent kinds of abuse that go on. But the law is an ass that eventually just catches up, but technology is always going so fast that we have this experience now where we're seeing in many cases that there is no law to prevent what's happening that's going wrong. And we're going to be seeing a lot more of that as these platforms enable new things. I mean, just to give you like one scary thing that's absolutely terrifying me, that's made it into the news recently, is that it's now possible to create completely lifelike fake videos of people saying things they never said. I mean, you can fake a video of Obama saying that he's a Nazi or something. I mean, you could do the most ludicrous things. And the sad fact of the matter is that a lot of people are going to believe this stuff. And I mean, I am just terrified of what can you do trying to run an election when people are watching videos of the people that, are supposedly running for office saying things that they never said, right? It's going to be chaos. Democracy cannot function with a broken feedback loop on reality. So, yeah.
Thank you. We have one more question here, which is, what about open software and open hardware and Creative Commons movements? Do you think they have any role in sharing economy?
Well, they predate the sharing economy, and I think it's a much more robust phenomenon. And, there have been people who've been doing research on how a lot of people are motivated to gain a reputation. They gain sort of, self-respect and a feeling of worth, by joining a community and contributing to these causes. And so the Maker movement and the open software movement, is just going to keep going. I mean, that's, I just don't see any end to that. I mean, I saw the sharing economy kind of come and go as people realize, people actually have to get up and do stuff and to participate in the sharing economy, and most people are not that willing to do that. They're, rather stay at home on their sofas, whereas It's much easier to participate in the open software community without ever getting off the sofa. And the maker community, I guess the hardware, you know, they form communities who just love the experience of making things. So there's a pull to that I don't think there was a motivation, you know, for sharing so much of it. You know, people are much more drawn to things where it's a experience of empowerment, being able to make stuff and gaining a reputation. And you don't get that from trading something on eBay particularly, or, you know, doing a small exchange in a sharing platform. So they are actually, I think, a much bigger phenomenon.
In line with that, so that's my question.
Yeah.
You have some crowd services like Be My Eyes, which is completely... Be My Eyes?
Be My Eyes? I don't know that one.
That one is the one that you have a blind person on one side and the person needs to see something like the color of a shirt or the expired date on something, and he's connected to a crowd service, then it will just call someone who's able at that time to tell them what they're looking at.
Right.
And that is completely, I mean, of course, you have a very low cost because it takes you like 2 minutes to tell them what you're looking at. But there's no other motivation like money or economics behind that. And it seems like it's working in the whole world, and it seems like it's providing a lot of help to people. And then you have all these other motivation like software, people love that, and there are other motivations. So do you think there's any way we could get these other things that motivate us to do things that are not money or economics that could make us help ourselves in the way that we do that doesn't necessarily involve the economy so much?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of human motivation, they call it the identifiable victim effect, which is where, you know, when, like you say, thousands of children in Africa are starving, nobody lifts a finger to do anything. But when one baby falls down a well, which is what happened in America one time, it was like a blow-by-blow news account of this small baby that fell down a well, and I think there was $800,000 were donated by the people watching on TV within a very short space of time, because it was this one baby crying down a well that they could identify with. And so, you know, if you can make stronger connection, you can make it more real, make it more individual, then I think there's a greater chance that people will want to help others. And so, you know, Kiva's been successful to a certain extent, which is the one where people donate to these small businesses of people in often, you know, underdeveloped countries. And so, you know, you see the bio of the person and you read their story and it generates some empathy. And I'm sure if they could make it be more like video and you could chat with people, you know, the closer you could feel, the better. And same thing, I think, with Be My Eyes. If you're having this live interaction, that's very rewarding. You have what's called the helper's high, which is whenever you help somebody, it actually activates the reward circuit in your own brain, and it actually makes you feel really good about yourself and really happy, you know, and that's something that is easily triggered in humans, where they, you know, like if just opening the door for a little old lady. In fact, if you're feeling crappy, just give up your seat to somebody on the bus and see how that makes you feel. You know, like doing something for somebody else is a really easy way to make yourself feel better. And I wish that more systems were, you know, built to encourage that. And as for me, you know, part of my job at Lyft is trying to figure out how to get people to use more sustainable transportation, you know, and because it's good for you to walk, it's good for you to exercise. And so, you know, I want to crack that kind of nut too.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Christina? Okay. Or not.
Thank you for your nice talk. I think it opened many, many questions, so I'm trying to be very objective here so I will not, you know, go over the time. Actually, there are two questions. One is related to the invisible hand. So I believe that, and I think this is why we working in mechanism design to try to design something that will guide people, align people to some social good. And then you present Lyft, that I think is a great idea, but you said that, okay, Lyft is buying the bike companies, buying the como é que é o patinete? The other vehicle, the scooter, yes.
Yes.
So when you start buying, it means that you are kind of solving by centralizing the problem instead of creating a market that will make people, okay, I'm interested to integrate to the Lyft cars because, you know, it opens a market to people to joining in this shared economy. So it brings me to the question of this integration is being forced by Lyft, by buying everything. And on the other hand, there is one end, that is the public transportation, trains and boats and airplanes, that you cannot buy. So you have to somehow to integrate and to have something. So what do you have to say about the solution, the centralized solution that Lyft is proposing, and also if you have any deal with the government so that, not the government, but with the public transportation, so this integration is feasible, is not forced?
So, well, I think that having one platform, it makes it more efficient. So if users don't have to worry about going from, one thing to another thing to another thing to figure out how their trip's going to work, that's the non-ideal situation. So you want to have one place you go and plan your trip. And that's much easier to do if you control all of the pieces of the trip. But obviously, if part of it's public transport, then we're not going to buy public transport. So we will buy the things. When I say we, Lyft will buy the things that are small enough that they can easily acquire it and then integrate it and control it from their platform. And these like little companies, that are running these scooter and bike services, they have their own little app, and that app itself is probably never. Those companies actually probably planned to get acquired by something eventually. I mean, that's a lot of the rule of a lot of these startups is if they don't get huge, they expect to get acquired and integrated into something bigger. And that's just the way that it works with these things. And so the smaller companies, if they're all on one platform, then you only have to build one application, you only have to have one payment system, you can standardize on bike design and part design and repair systems and helmet systems and security systems, you know what I'm saying? So it's those economies of scale that just make it sort of more efficient to run a service, as opposed to having 5 different bike companies all operating in the one area, and then you've got the app for this one, but you haven't got the app for that one, and it just makes it more. Sorry? Sorry, I can't hear you. You'll have to get the microphone.
So, but by allowing Lyft to buy everything, you create another problem of monopoly. So you go to one solution. And I don't know if you have this, probably you have in US about cartel.
Yeah.
That, yes, that is kind of, at least here is against the law. So if you buy all the chain, so it's because you are not allowing competition. So you're going to be the only one, and this might be a problem for the clients, because now instead of, okay, great, Lyft is great, it's like, it's kind of, I don't have an option. So the price might raise just because of that. It's just something to think about.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever heard of Uber, but they are the monopoly in most places. And so where there is no Lyft, there is always Uber. And in fact, we are the competition. So we're sort of, for a while, Uber was actually the bad guy, but they've actually been taken over by a CEO who is much less of a bad guy. So now it's a real battle. I think it's a great competition, because you have 2 big players, and where you have 2 big players like that, you're sure going to get a lot of competition. Nobody is going to have an easy ride of it, and that means that the passengers and the drivers win, because we're doing everything we can to attract them. So we don't take big profits. In fact, the challenge for Uber and Lyft is how to be profitable, because we're actually spending money, not making money.
Okay, thank you. I'd like us to thank Victoria. We have to finish now because we have the opening session in a little while. And then I'm sure she'll be around all these days. So if you have any questions and any further things that you'd like to discuss with her, she'll be available. So Victoria, thank you so much for a very stimulating talk and for sharing all your experience with us. This is just a token of our appreciation, so you can remind you of your time here in Belém and Brazil. I'll open it.